you've always had a keen interest in full stack web development, then you've come to the right place. This course has been designed for both beginners as well as experienced web developers who seek a practical approach to web development. In this course, we learn all the fundamentals of web development and learn to code from scratch. We'll begin by installing and exploring our scripting environment, after which we'll move on to programming languages of the web. Now, this includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even PHP. We'll cover both front-end and back-end technology stacks. Throughout the course, we'll develop a bunch of interactive web applications that you can add to your profile to strengthen your credibility as a full-stack web developer. From responsive e-commerce applications, style booking systems, and even HR systems, rest assured that this will be a hands-on course. As a bonus, you will also learn all about SQL databases and how to integrate them into your website. In this lesson, we explore HTML inputs as well as forms, and these are ideal elements when we want to capture data from the user so that we can process that data either for back-end purposes or to make our website more dynamic. So without further ado, let's dive in. Once again, a warm welcome from all of us here at Shaw Academy, where we are here to help you learn the skills you need to succeed today. Now, as many of you already know, my name is Rushin Weingard and I'm your educator for this course. As your educator, my goal is to take you on a journey to becoming a full-stack web developer. Now, as mentioned before, in today's lesson, lesson 5, we'll be having a look at HTML inputs. And again, we're going to break this down in terms of what the objectives are. So let's briefly just dive into objectives and unpack what's coming up in this particular lesson. Now, when we refer to inputs, we can basically refer to them as HTML input types. And this is the first thing we're going to be working with, the actual input types in HTML. And we'll have a look at the various input types for which use cases and why we use them for certain web pages and how we can actually use them to capture data. We'll also have a look at the difference in aesthetics between the various HTML input types. And then moving on, we'll create our very first HTML form as well in our practical sessions. So we'll first have a look at what a form looks like. We'll look at the architecture of the form, what basically makes up a really good form in web development, and then lastly we'll implement all of this in our practical session at the end of this lesson. Now, this is going to be a very extensive practical session where we'll be covering quite a bit of things, and we'll also be bringing a lot of everything we've learned so far in web development together in this practical session. So I think it's going to be quite exciting for all of us. Now that we have a fairly good sense of where we are going, let's start with our very first topic in this lesson, and that is working with HTML input types. Now, when we refer to HTML input, we are referring to the elements that we as developers use in our web development process to make a website more interactive and dynamic. And this allows us to build features into our website that makes it a lot more responsive, user-friendly, and all of those important things when it comes to the user experience domain inside of a website. Now, to create an input element, we must use the tag called input, just like you would create an H tag for a heading, and then we specify the type of input that we want to create when we specify that we are using an input tag. So a type could be a text, a radio button, just a simple button, for example. There are a ton of types of attributes that you can actually have a look at. So why do we use HTML elements that are input elements? Why are they so important? Well, firstly, we use these kind of elements or these input elements because there are often instances where you want to capture data from the user for processing. A typical example here would be like logging in. When a user logs in, they normally put in their username as well as the password. That gets sent to the server or the database to validate that that record exists, and then some sort of action happens. Or you could even just fill in data for a quote or a query, for example. Okay, this is why it's so important. This is one of the reasons we specifically use input elements. We also use it to pass data to the backend, and this is something we just mentioned. In the event that we want to send data to the server and get a response from that server, the server then shapes how our client responds. This is also an extremely important reason as to why we would use input elements. Okay, and then lastly, it shapes the client server response, if you will. Okay, and that encompasses everything we just mentioned. Depending on the input that you send to the server or the backend, the server or the backend is going to respond in a certain way, and then hopefully you get your actual result at the end of the day that you were looking for. So with all that being said, let's have a look at some of the examples when it comes to the different types of HTML inputs out there. And here I've compiled a simple table of the most useful ones and the ones I think are used quite often in the web development space for their own specific reasons. Okay, first we have the button input, which is essentially just a clickable button. Then we have a text input type, which is a simple field where you can actually enter text, normally a single line. We also have a checkbox, and a checkbox allows users to select or deselect a single value. Then we also have a radio button. Now, a radio button and a checkbox are more or less the same thing, but they vary, and I'll show you an example in a second. So a radio button is a clickable checkbox that allows users to select a single value from a list of options that share a similar value characteristic or attribute. And then we have the password input type, which is also just a single line field, but allows you to obscure and hide the text that you are actually entering into that field. We also have the range input type, which is just a slider that accepts a minimum and a maximum value. We have the submit button. Now, very, very importantly, the normal button and a submit button are more or less the same. We tend to use a submit button when we actually have a form that we want to pass data from. Okay, that's the biggest difference between the two. And then we have the date and time input type, which is extremely powerful if you don't want your user to have to manually type in a specific date and time with a particular format. This object really helps save a lot of time when it comes to inputting data. And then lastly, we have the email input type. And again, this is also a text field, a single line normally, where you can enter an email address, a valid email address. Now, when you're submitting a form with an input type of email, it's actually going to validate that the email format is correct before actually processing the data in that form. Now, in the event that you do want to find out more about the input element and forms and so on, you can visit Firefox's developer platform, okay? And here you can simply just run a search, something like HTML input elements, Firefox developer tools, and you should be directed to this page as one of the links in Google's search index. And what you'll find is an array of explanations for each of the various input type elements out there. Now, again, we didn't cover all of them. I'm just showing you this link in the event that you, again, do want to find out more about the various input types. And what you'll notice is that in this example over here, they actually give you some output of what it would look like in terms of if you had to use these input types. So this is an excellent resource if you want to have a look at the attributes associated with various inputs and just to get an example of how the inputs work. Okay, so I really hope this is going to be a useful resource for you moving forward. Now, I've also tasked myself with actually compiling some code and showing you what the output looks like when we work with a different kind of input text. So let's run through the list and actually have a look at what the output looks like for each of them in the client. Now, firstly, here we just have a very basic input type of type text, okay, and this again is just a single line text editing field where you can add some normal text like your username or your password or whatever the case is. You won't be using your password for this kind of text field because you want to obscure your password to hide the actual values. Keep that in mind. Next up, we have buttons, and buttons are inputs if you think about it, because when the user clicks down on a button, that sends some sort of signal to the client, okay? And this is what the code looks like for a button. We say input type, we specify button, and then we can add something like a value to get an output that looks something like this, okay? Now, the value here is the text that actually appears on the button. In my case, I just said click me. So moving on, we also have checkboxes, and here it works a little differently when we set up our checkboxes, because what you'll see here is we have option 1, option 2, and option 3. The values are different in that they range from option 1 to option 3 in terms of the value, and the type is that of checkbox. Okay, now very importantly, when we load this up, this is what our input looks like. Now when it comes to checkboxes, you can check multiple boxes. Okay, this is different from radio buttons, which I will show you in a second. So when working with checkboxes, you can allow the user to select multiple values and not just one single value. And as mentioned before, we also have radio buttons, and this is the code for radio buttons. Now, radio buttons, we have a very similar flow to that of checkboxes, where we have option 1, option 2, and then option 2 again, for example. But now what we have here is the name and not the value. there's an attribute called name here, and the name of that attribute is radio list 1 for all three. So what we've essentially done here is we've grouped multiple radio buttons together, and then again we just associated it with the type of radio. Now if we look at the output for this, what you'll note here is that unlike with checkboxes, you can only select one value from a list of values that share the exact same name. A typical example here could be something like an MCQ list for a questionnaire or a survey where the user can only select one particular value. We also have the range input type, and with the range input type, it's just basically a slider where you can select a maximum, a middle value, or a minimum value, if you will, okay? And we specify the input type as range, and this is what the output looks like, a slider. This is something I think many of us are familiar with. Sliders are quite popular, or the range data input is quite popular if you think about it when it comes to videos embedded on the internet, where you can increase and decrease the volume because you'd have your minimum volume and you'd have your maximum volume. Next up, we have the email input type when it comes to this particular element. And this is nothing special or not all that different from using a text field input type. The only difference I would say is that if you look at the output that we have over here, what could happen is whenever you hover over a field that is of email type, in the background, in your cache of your browser, your client, you would generally use multiple email accounts or email addresses in an email field that gets stored in the client, okay? And you'll see in the example over here, what we have is when I hover over, I click or I focus on this field, this text box, it will give me a list of email addresses that I've used previously. So this is one feature of an email address when it comes to the input type specifically. Another feature is that it will validate to check when you submit a form. Okay. Now, in conjunction with using the email field or just a text field that accepts username, we can also use the password field or input type, and we just specify the type as password in parentheses. And this is what the output looks like for that. Something that many of us are familiar with when punching out our passwords into a system. The text is hidden or obscured so that other users don't necessarily know what you are typing into the client or into the system. And then lastly, we have the date time element or object or even input type. And it's exactly that. It allows you to capture the date time from a UI element embedded in your client or your website. And we reference this simply by saying date time dash locale. We also have just the datetime object, but it's now become obsolete across many clients. Therefore, we use the datetime locale type when we use this particular object. And this is what the output looks like for that. So in different clients, it's going to look different. In Firefox, in Chrome, and Microsoft Edge, the UI can vary, but essentially the behavior is the same. And what we have here is we just have this nicely formatted UI element that holds the actual date, the month, the year, and so on, as well as the time that you can select when you want to input that into a form, for example. Given that we now have a good understanding of input types, let's move on to our next topic, creating HTML forms and understanding why they are so important. So what makes HTML forms so powerful? Well, essentially, when it comes to HTML forms, it allows the client, which is your browser, to capture data from the user so that you can, again, make your website dynamic or query the database. And when we want to use forms, we use the form element. This defines a form in our website, okay? And this is how we set it up to actually collect user input or data. Now, when it comes to HTML forms, there are a couple of things we must take into consideration. Number one, that data validation does sometimes exist, especially when you are querying a database. Secondly, there are operations outside of HTML that take place when using a form, and this could be getting things from the server, using an API, and all of these kind of things can happen in the background when it comes to HTML forms. And then lastly, forms are highly flexible. So when it comes to forms, you can actually color them. You could increase the different kinds of attributes such as your width, your height, your animation. There is so much you can do when it comes to forms to make it more appealing and more attractive for users to actually engage with your website. Wonderful. Now let's take a look at a typical example of a login form. So here we've got our code on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the actual output of that form. And our form starts off with a heading 2 tag, which is HTML forms. And that is interpreted by the client as this wording over here, HTML forms, Moving on, we have another heading of login form, which is of type 3 heading, and this gets interpreted by the browser as such with the text login form. And now we start opening up our form, and everything inside the form is going to be the content hosted inside our form. Okay, very, very important. And the first thing hosted inside of our form here is the username text, which is a paragraph tag, and we can see this in the client as well. Moving on, we have our very first input type of text, and we gave it a name of username. Okay, and this is interpreted by the client, and here we simply just punch in some random text like John Wick. After this, we have another paragraph tag, which is called password, and then as before, we have another input type, but the input type here is different from text. It's now password, okay? And we gave it a name of PWD, short for password. And we can see that the password is obscured, so you can't necessarily see what the user is typing into the client or into that particular field because it's of type password. Then we have our submit type, okay? Now, our submit type is essentially just a button, and we gave it a value of login. This is the very last input type, which is our button over here. And then our last two href elements over here at the bottom, these are just links that you would generally find in a login form, such as sign up, as well as did you forget your password, would you like to change your password. Now, very, very basic, very, very bare bones. We are going to be recreating this in our practical session in this lesson. Now, before we close things off with our final topic in this lesson, let's have a look at what's coming up in our next lesson, lesson 6. In our next lesson, you'll be introduced to CSS as a styling language. This will give you an idea of how to go about styling a bare-bone website to something more appealing to end users. CSS is the most popular language used when it comes to styling our website, and it is capable of dramatically improving the usability of a website. So stay tuned because things are going to become a lot more colorful. Excellent stuff. Now for our very last topic in today's lesson, which is our practical session in web development. And before we even jump into any sort of code, let's have a look at our output and what we're going to be trying to achieve today. So in our session that's coming up, first of all, we'll design this very simple login form. Okay, and it's very unconventional because you could just type in a bunch of text and do whatever you want to do. You click login, nothing's going to happen. It's going to sort of just reset that form. As default behavior, we have a sign up link. We've got a forgot password link. And now we've seen all of this in one of the slides that we mentioned earlier. The interesting content comes in when we actually want to browse this website. So let's assume the user logs in successfully. They can then click on the link that says cars, and they can view the different specs between two different cars over here. And this might be familiar based on our previous lesson, the Toyota GR Supra and the BMW M2 Competition Pack. We are going to embed this media. Okay, it's going to be our first time working with images. We'll create a table with the details for each of these cars or the specifications. And then if the user clicks log out, they log out, which is sort of the default behavior. When you do log out, you get sent to the login form again. Alternatively, if they're in cars or wherever they are in the website, they can also view the race. I think this is going to be a little exciting because here we'll actually embed a video. Okay, and the video, when we click play, this video is essentially going to play through and give us a 3-minute view of a race between a Toyota Supra and a BMW M2 Competition Pack. Hope you find this quite exciting. Now that we have a fairly good idea of what we're trying to achieve, let's boot up Atom and let's start coding. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is booting up Atom, right? And we essentially need to create a new file over here. So I'm going to say new file and I'm going to save it immediately. You'll get untitled by default. I will save this as login dash sign up dash form.html. Very, very importantly, you do not want to forget the extension at the end. And you'll see we've got a couple of images or media resources in here. These are the files we're going to embed in our website. So I'll save this up and then I'll start scripting by opening up with an HTML tag. And I will call the very first page in my website a login page by default with title. And then moving on, we can have the login as title, but we also maybe want to add something in the header. So let's go ahead and add, we don't even need a header. Let's just clean up some space over here so that visually it looks better. So in my body over here, I'm going to include an h2 tag. And I'm going to say this one is called login. Save this, come down at the bottom, And then I'm going to include some sort of navigation in a moment. But before I do that, I want to make sure my website is working correctly. Okay, so I'll just pop over to my login. And there we go. I've got my login page. Great stuff. So let's close this off and get back into Atom. Now, once I've got my header, I now want to include some sort of navigation function. So I'm going to say nav, I'm going to add an unordered list in here, and then I'm going to start adding my list items. Now, the first list item is going to be that of the index page. So I'll say anchor, enter, and I'm going to say index.html. Okay, so we haven't created this page yet, by the way, but we will in a second. And then while doing that, because I'm going to copy and paste this code at a later stage, I'll create several more list items. So I'll say anchor tag, yes please, and then I will call this one maybe drag race.html. And again, these are pages we still need to create. And this one over here, I'm going to call, let's paste another one. I'm going to call this one login, which is for this particular page that we're actually building out now. Login, sign up dash form. Now keep in mind, since this is for this page, we need to make sure that the name of the file that we created is identical to what we add to our href, because it's going to look for this file. Now, finishing touches over here, I'm going to call this one, this index page, I'm going to call cars. This one over here, I will say view race. That's where you can go and check out the video. And then this one is here. It's going to be, this one here is going to be the login page. Now let's just double check, make sure everything is working beautifully. And if we have a look now, we can actually see we've got cars, view race, and we've got login. Okay, but now the hyperlink functionality is missing. And that could be as a result of, here we go. So these paragraph sort of tags that I added here, they need to be moved. So I'm going to say cars, cut that out, and I'm going to paste it over here because it needs to be in my anchor tag and not my list item. Therefore, we never got those highlighting factors in our text. So I'm going to say login as well, cut that out. Just in case you're wondering if you're writing out the code as I'm writing it, then this should resolve your issue. Now we've got that hyperlink effect. Lovely stuff. And then after my nav, I'm going to start creating my form. Okay, so I've got my navigation. Now I'm going to say form. I'm going to remove the class over here, and I'm going to call this one ID equals my dash form. The action is not something we have to worry about now because we tend to use things like PHP when it comes to using the action attribute as well as the method attribute. We are not trying to post anything or get any sort of data, so I can remove that as well. Save that, and I've got my form. Let's give it some space. And the first thing I'm going to add to my form is a paragraph tag for username. Username, save that up. And then the second thing I want to add is a break tag just to give it a bit of space. So a line break over here, and I'm going to say that I want this to be an input type of text. Okay, so we specify input, and then it's going to ask you for the type. That's the first thing that you must insert, okay, depending on your needs. And the name over here, I will just call something like username. The value we can leave as blank because the moment we add a value, it's going to hold the value when the page loads. It's not something we want. We tend to use things like placeholders for that. So let's refresh and see what we have so far. There we go. But this seems a bit too spacious. This doesn't necessarily look all that great. So we can fix that by simply just removing our break tag over here. Save it up now. Have a look at what we have. And there we go. That looks much, much better. Okay. So essentially we could just type in any sort of text over here, but we're not going to do that. Okay. So I'll just leave this blank and I'll head back over here. And I'm going to start writing out my code for my password. Now here I can add a break tag because I want this to be on a separate line. Paragraph tag. I'm going to say password. And below this, I want another input element. I want this, however, to be an input element of password. And then the value, I don't want it to retain any specific value. The name, I will just give pwd. Save that. And I want to add 2 line breaks next because I'm going to be adding a submit button over here. And remember, submit button is slightly different from that of a normal button input. So input, and I want this to be of type submit, because remember, when we're working with a form, you want the form to take the data that's within each field or within each input, and you want to submit that for processing. Okay, so I'm just following convention here. And then the value, maybe give it login so that on the button it reflects as the login button. And then the last couple of things I want to do is I want to create 2 href tags for the sign up and the forgot password. So to do that, I can just break out of this with a break tag out of this line. And over here, I'll add an anchor tag. For the href, we don't need anything because this is not going to redirect the user to anything specific or any specific page, okay? It's just for visual effect, if you will. I'll say sign up. And then the next one, another anchor tag, I will give this one a value of forgot password question mark. Great, and that should be everything. I just need to add a break over here so that they are on separate lines. Now, if we refresh our page, voila, we have exactly what we had in our slides. We've got a navigation system at the top, we've got a username paragraph, we've got the field associated with that, we've got password, and we've got our login button as well as our sign up and forgot password links. Great stuff. So now we can actually move on to our second page in our website, which is going to be the cause page, if you will. And to create this page, I need to head back over into Atom. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another new file, and I'm going to save this one as index. So we are slightly deviating from our initial approach where our very first page in our website would be index, but because this is my home page sort of in my website, I'm naming this one index. So go ahead and enter and then start writing out my script. So I'm going to call the title over here, I'm going to call cause. And the next thing I want to do is I want to add my header. Or I really don't need to add any header here. What I can do is I could just use the body tag from our previous page, and this is going to help a lot. In future, always try to reuse code where you can. And I'm going to show you an example of this. So I'm going to copy this entire section over here. I can actually take it from here, right? And I'm going to paste this in my body. Let's space this out so that it's just better looking. And I'm going to change login over here. I'm going to change to cause, okay? So you might be asking yourself, why am I doing this? Well, my navigation system is going to be exactly the same across every single page. So therefore, I want to make sure it's standardized with my login page, my index page, and the viewing the drag race page as well. Okay, so after my navigation system, I can go ahead and add in a horizontal line break. Let's actually just get this correct. I'm going to say HR. I'm going to add a width over here. I'm going to manipulate the width attribute. I'm going to set this equal to 1000 pixels. Great stuff. So I can now just go and check this out to see if it works correctly in the website. So cause, there we go. So you see my navigation system remains exactly the same between my login page and my cause page. Great. So moving on, I can now go and add my content, which is going to be the image and all of those things. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a section so I can distinguish between the two sections of both cars. Just space this out nicely. And I'm going to add a H2 tag over here. And I'm going to call this, let's say, Toyota GR Supra. Okay. Now, I am sitting with a slight issue, which is not necessarily detrimental, but I want to make sure that my main heading stands out from my secondary heading over here. So I'm going to change this to an H1 tag instead. So I need to edit both the opening and the closing tags over here. So I'll save that. And then moving on, I'm going to embed my image. Now, this is the first time that we are ever embedding images, but it's pretty straightforward, just like with any other element. So we type in img, it's going to auto-generate everything for us. And now I need to add the source over here for my image, okay? And the source I want to add here is going to be gr-supra-night. And very, very importantly, I will always highlight this where I can. You want to make sure that you're getting the extension right. So I'm going to say JPEG. because it's a JPEG file. And I'll save that, head back over to my website and see what I have so far. So I've got the Supra, but it's huge. We don't necessarily want this huge image taking up all the space unless we're writing some sort of blog post about this particular car. Okay, but here we are comparing two cars. So it's a slightly different approach. I can also add a couple of other attributes to my image. And the first one I'm going to add is the ID, which equals, let's just say Supra. And I want the width, but let's decrease the width as well. We can remove the alt tag. So I'll say width is equal to 640 pixels. Save that. Let's see what we have so far. Refresh, and much better. Okay. So you might be asking yourself, where are we getting this path from? This is the source attribute, and remember we need to get the path right as to where this image is laying. Now, if we go have a look at what we've created so far, this is our index page, and here's the image that we just referenced. Now, these two files are sitting in the exact same folder. Therefore, you can just immediately sort of distinguish between when something is sitting a level up or a level below. I could have created a separate folder called images and then done all of the heavy work, but we're not going to get too complex with this. Okay, so just a heads up in case you're wondering how the source works. And then I'm also going to add a border to this image. So I'll add the border after the ID. So this is just another attribute. Let's just get this right. This is just another attribute that we are working with. And I'm going to give this one a border of 5 pixels. Let's refresh and see what we have so far. Great stuff. So now we have a border around our image, which is black. Later on, we will manipulate this and change the color. For the time being, I think this is all we need. Next, I'm going to add a paragraph tag. And this paragraph tag is just going to be the price of this particular item or this particular car. So price. And this one comes in at $51,945. I'm going to give this a class because later on I'm going to create the same thing for the BMW, and I want the classes to be edited accordingly. Remember, this is the difference between an ID and a class, and I will be demoing that in this lesson as well. So I'm going to just call this prices, save that, and now I can start with my table, which is probably going to be the most complex thing we do in this lesson. So let's open up my table over here, and now the first thing I need to add in my table is a table row, which is going to be the very first row in my table, and I want that to be the headings. Okay, so TR, open, closing, and inside here I want to add a TH, which is my table heading tag. And in here I want to specify information about the car and then maybe a bit of detail. So I can add another one over here, TH, and details. Now this might be slightly intimidating. Rest assured, it's not that hard to understand. So let's have a look at what we have so far. So now we've got information and we've got details, which is a table, but it's not formatted very nicely because we want everything to be split up so we can actually see from a visual perspective that this is a table and we want to organize our information accordingly. Okay, so I'm going to head back over to my table and I'm going to add a border to my table of, let's say, 1 pixel. 1 pixel is all we need for now. So under my table tag or my table element, the opening one over here, I can just specify border, and I'll say 1 pixel. Save that, head back over, refresh. Now my table looks much better. Okay, so now let's add a bit of information to our table so that we can actually see that it is a table. The next thing I want to do is I want to add another row. Okay, so the row I'm going to add here is just, now this is not a heading, keep that in mind. This should actually not be this side. We should actually include this after we've created our headings over here, our table headings. So I'm just going to one line down, TR. And here I'll say the first thing I want to note of this vehicle is the drivetrain. So I'm going to say drivetrain, but in this row I also want a cell. Okay, remember, cell is just a piece of self-isolated information, much like with an Excel sheet. Okay, so I'm going to say this is the drivetrain of this car, drivetrain, and then I'm going to include another TD tag, which is going to be the actual drivetrain of this car, front engine rear wheel drive. Okay, let's see what we have so far. Hopefully everything works out beautifully. Wonderful. So now we've got information, which is the drivetrain of our car, as well as the details associated with that. Now I've got a lot of content that I need to go through here. So I'm going to copy and paste from my existing solution so that we can actually get an idea of what's going on. So far, we've created a table, we've created the headings associated with that, and we've created two separate cells in another row that allows us to host that information. So the next thing I want to go and add is another row. Okay, so row, in here, my TD tag, which is just a cell. And the next one is going to be engine type. So again, I'm going to be copying and pasting because I've got everything on my screen already. Feel free to type it out. What I do suggest is that when we're working through tutorials together, try not to code along with me. Instead, rather sit back, relax, enjoy the session, and then maybe rewatch it and tackle everything along with me. It just makes it a lot easier for you to grasp the information. And then I'm going to add another row. So TR, TD. In here, I want the power of the vehicle. So in terms of horsepower, for example, it could be. And I will say TD again. Within that row, I will then just add what I have, copy and paste. Now we've got 382 horsepower at 6,500 RPMs. Okay, let's save that. And let's just go with everything while we have it, and then we'll actually review the website to make sure what's going on. So another row and another TD tag in here. And I want this to be the torque of the vehicle. And then the specific torque for this vehicle is going to be, actually I need to add a TD tag over here. The torque of this vehicle is going to be, oh, this is a lengthy one, so I need to copy and paste this one. So let's paste this over here, refresh, and let's see what we have. So we've got the drivetrain, we've got the engine type, we've got the power of this vehicle, the torque, and all of those things. So we can add maybe 2 more lines over here, or let's say 3 more lines. So again, I'll go DR, TD. Inside here, I want this to be the 0 to 60 speed in terms of miles. So 0 to 60 miles per hour. And this car apparently goes really, really fast, which is why it's one of my favorite. So this one comes in at 3.8 seconds. Save that. Let's add our last 2 couple of rows. So TR. And this one's going to be the transmission. So TD. Toast my cell. Trans. What is it? What did I say? Transmission. I said transmission, correct? So transmission. And later on, I want to add the actual speed of this transmission, which is 8 speed. 8. Unfortunately, the Supra only comes in automatic, which is not all that great for car enthusiasts. Automatic. There we go. Let's save this. And then lastly, we have the fuel economy for this vehicle. So TR again, TD inside of here. And let's say fuel economy. Let's see, did I get that right? No, I've got a spelling error here. So fuel economy. There we go. And then our last cell over here, I want to format, and this is going to be the combined fuel of this actual vehicle. So this is combined city and highway. Great. Save that. Let's head back over. And voila, now we've got our table. So we've got everything. We've got the image, we've got the price of this particular car, and we have the details associated with it. Okay. Now let's do the exact same for the BMW. But just to not waste too much time, let's just copy and paste what we have from here and then format it accordingly. Okay. So to do this, I'm going to perhaps add a break at the bottom of the section so we can break out nicely and have everything spaced out beautifully. And I'm going to add another HR tag over here. And I'm going to give this one a width of, again, 1000 pixels to remain consistent. And I'm going to create a new section below this, okay? So I'm going to say section. Let's save. We don't have to refresh because we didn't really make any sort of visible differences. Okay. And again, copying and pasting is extremely important. So I'm going to copy and paste all of this that I have over here, this table, because the information is going to be exactly the same. We're just going to change the details and the image associated with that car. So let's space it out over here. This is where our section ends and this is where our new section begins. So space it out, paste this in. Now we can start editing all of this. So for the BMW, we are going to have our headings. Let's see. This is a heading 2 over here. We can actually set this to something like headings because we want our headings to remain consistent as well, right? So we can say class. We can call this one headings. Save that. And we can actually copy and paste this and add it to where we created the Supra's details. So we can just include it in our opening tag here. Save that. So we've got headings, we've got the width, we've got the ID, which is Supra. Now we can start actually changing these things. So I'm going to say BMW M2. And did we say wanted, do we really want, let's actually just type it out, competition. Competition. Did I get that correctly? Yes, I did. And let's save and see what we have so far. So we should have a duplicate of this, okay? Which we do. But the differentiating factor here is the heading we just created or altered. So I'm going to also change the image over here to BMW M2 dash M2. We're going to keep the pixels at 5 and we want to change this one over here. Instead of having the Supra, because it's an ID, remember an ID needs to be unique, so we want to change this to M2. And then we can keep the width, we can keep everything else. The price obviously is going to be different. The price here is actually $59,000, which is, well, almost $60,000 actually. So let's change this. And then we can also change the border. We can keep the information, the details, that's generic. We can keep that. The drivetrain is going to change. So instead of, well, they're actually pretty much the same. Both of these cars are rear-wheel drive cars, so we can keep them as is. And then the engine type I'm going to change. Let's see, so we've got engine type, both are turbocharged if I'm not mistaken. The only difference is that the one, if I'm not mistaken, they're both inline 6s. So we can actually keep them both as turbocharged inline 6. BMW might be a V8, something I might have to look up. In any case, the power is obviously different. So the power over here is going to be 400 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. Just paste that in. Our torque is going to be slightly different as well. So again, we're just trying to differentiate between the two cars over here. So paste that. The speed, believe it or not, is different as well. The BMW comes in at 0.1 seconds slower. And then the transmission is 6-speed instead of 8-speed. So we can just alter that and say 6-speed. And then the combined city, highway, and yeah, the fuel economy here is also slightly different. It comes in at a bit lower, which is one of the advantages of the BMW, I suppose. And this one comes in at 17 and finally at 23. So if you want to save petrol or if you really want to save on fuel, then you would obviously opt for the BMW. Great stuff. Let's save this and refresh to see what we have. And there we go. There is a big difference between our two images that we now embedded. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to create the very last page of our website. And the page that I want to create next is just a simple video embedded media file where you can actually view the race between the GR Supra as well as the M2 competition pack. So let's head back over to Atom. And the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another new file, which is going to be my last one for the day. And I'll save this first of all. And I will call this one drag-race.html. Okay, now we can start scripting. So I'll say HTML. Everything else should be standard. I will maybe go ahead and change this to view race. And then I'm going to include in my body tag, we can just space this out. Again, you don't have to be doing this. I just prefer this because it makes everything a lot more cleaner. I'm going to add a H1 tag over here that says view race. And then I'm going to add my navigation system that I had from my previous pages. And to do that, I'm just going to copy and paste instead of writing code from scratch. So we can actually go ahead over here and we can select our navigation system that we created over here. So we can just copy that over like we've done before and like we've been doing. And we can just say copy over here, or Control C if you are in a Windows system, and let's head back over to this in our body. Let's give it a bit of space, and we've got a navigation menu now. Let's save that, and let's make sure everything's working correctly first of all. So let's scroll back up. If I head over to my cars page, that works fine. My login page, that works fine. My view race, it's coming together nicely. Okay, so back over to Atom, and I might just want to add another. Let's actually see something over here. The view race should be on top, so we can actually take this, cut it out, and paste it not below, but above our navigation system that we just created. Let's give it a bit of space over here. Save that. I'm going to include a horizontal line once again, and I'm going to give it a width of 1000 pixels like we've been doing. I'll save that. So the next thing we can go and do it is actually add that video in, okay, because there's not much to do on this particular page. So after my line break, I need to add a break tag, and then I'm going to add a video tag. And remember, in our previous lesson, we specified that we must have the source available. So I'm going to call this one m2-supra-drag.mp4, because this is an MP4 file after all. Okay, so keep that in mind. You must ensure that you are constantly and that you are always including the extension of the file that you are working with. You cannot forget this because you might just have an error when you try to load your website. Wonderful. And we can actually validate this by just heading over to our folder where all our resources is. And if we right click on this and we say properties, we can actually see in the details here that this is indeed an MP4 file. Let's see, the extension should be available here. It's not showing up immediately, maybe under general. Here we go, MP4 file. Okay, so very, very important. Now let's head back over to Atom and let's finish up with the final touches. We don't need the autoplay attribute, so I'll remove that. We don't need the poster attribute either, so I can remove that. All we need is at least the controls attribute. And because this video is quite large, I'm going to give it a width of 720 pixels. Then I'll save that. And let's see what we have so far. So it's not loading up correctly. This might be because I referenced the source incorrectly. So if I head back over here, M2, Supra, drag list, let's see what we have. We can actually just highlight this, grab the name directly from here, because it's going to ensure that we don't have any other issues. And I will paste this. There we go. So it was a syntax error after all. So refresh again. And there we go. Our video is loading up nicely. Let's see if it actually plays. Oh wow, look at that. We've embedded our very first video file. Gosh, I love these two cars. These are two of my favorite cars.
Hello and welcome to... At least this is closer than you might... Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So I'm going to leave it at that, because if you do want to check the video out, it is available on YouTube or at cars.co.za. I don't want to spoil it for you. And that brings us to the end of just our content. Now, the last thing we want to do here is we actually want to style our index page, which is our car page, right? And we'll do that in a second, just like we did in our previous lesson with the styles element, okay? So the first thing we need to do is we need to head over back to our head over here, and we need to include a style tag. So we have an opening and closing one. Let's save that up. And in my style tag over here, I'm only going to be styling a couple of things. The first thing I want to target is my Supra ID that we created in our index page. Okay, so remember we're working within the index page, which is actually our car page. So I'm going to say hashtag Supra open curly brace, close curly brace, and then I'm going to give it a border color of blue. Close that off, save this up, and then I'm also going to, maybe I should just remove this media screen over here. Let's see, just for consistency's sake, let's save that. No, it's actually, the reason we have the media screen attribute there is because we are, let's just undo, there we go, because we want to make sure that our website is responsive across multiple devices. I'm going to add a width to that image of 450 pixels. We don't actually have to be doing this, but what I want to show you is something very special. So let me save this and head back over to the website. And if I head back over to cars, you'll see that the Supra is now smaller than the BMW and also has a border. Now, very, very important. Whenever I say very, very important, I mean really, really important. So when we're working in style sheets or CSS documents, it's always going to override whatever we insert inside of our web page here, where we specified 640 pixels for the width initially. Okay, just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then I'm going to start styling the M2. And let's say squiggly brace, M2. And over here, I'm going to give this one a border color. Oh, I keep spelling border wrong for some reason. So border color, I'm going to say orange. And I'm going to give this one a width of, for consistency's sake, 450 pixels as well. Let's save that. Let's actually cut this out and have this appended to the top of our head tag so that it's immediately available in terms of styling. Okay, there we go. And what you'll notice is that we also get the color pop now, which makes it easier to see what is the difference between our CSS and our HTML. Okay, so we've got a style tag, we've got our opening tag, closing tab, we've got everything included inside. Let's refresh, make sure that everything is being maintained. That is the case. My BMW is not scaling properly though, and that might be because of a syntax issue. So I forgot my colon over here. Okay, save that. So we can move over to our headings. Let's just ensure and make 100% sure everything is working correctly. Great stuff. Now I'm going to edit my headings. Okay, so dot headings, because remember we're targeting a class now. Dot headings, opening, closing, curly brace, as well as closing. And I want the font style to be that of italic. Italic, close that off. And then the last thing I want to do is have my prices be slightly different. So prices, open, closing, curly brace, and I'm going to give it a font style. Font style of italic as well. Italic. Let's close that off. Let's see what we have so far. Let me just space this out. And if I hit back over to my browser, this has been changed as well as my headings. My headings are now italic. These are classes, by the way. This as well as our prices, these are both classes. The only IDs here is essentially our cars or the images, because they have different colors and we styled them differently. So if we have an overview of what we've just developed in the last 45 minutes, we've developed a basic login page that you can implement JavaScript with, or PHP. We've included a comparable sort of website where you can compare two cars, the Supra and the BMW, with images embedded, with media embedded. We've created a table, we've worked with IDs and classes, and then lastly, we've also included a video in our website. So I think that is a lot to take in just for one session, and I hope this was really useful. Keep in mind, if you do want to copy and paste my code, except for the files such as the videos as well as the images, I will be making this available to you via the summary notes. And that brings us to the end of lesson 5. So I hope that this was a very useful lesson. I know it was a bit taxing because we did quite a bit, but in our next lesson, in lesson 6, things are going to get a bit more interesting when we start styling our websites using CSS. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.